You have been told that debt is the enemy. Pay it off as fast as you can. Cut up the credit cards. Never borrow money you do not have to. Live below your means and stay out of the red at all costs. That advice feels responsible. It feels safe. For a lot of people, it is the single financial principle they hold on to more tightly than any other. But there is a version of that advice, followed too rigidly, applied without nuance, that quietly costs people more than the debt ever would have. And almost nobody in personal finance talks about it because avoid debt is easy to say, easy to understand, and almost impossible to argue with in a headline. This is not an argument for going into debt. It is an argument for understanding what debt actually is, because the difference between debt that builds your future and debt that destroys it is not the debt itself. It is the interest rate, the purpose, and what you do with the alternative. Let's start with something almost everyone agrees on. High-interest debt is a financial emergency. A credit card charging 22% annually is not a financial tool. It is a hole in the floor of your finances, and everything you pour in drains straight through it. If you have high-interest debt, paying it off aggressively is one of the highest return financial moves available to you. That part of the advice is completely correct, but that is not the only kind of debt that exists. There is a category of debt that behaves almost like the opposite. Debt that, under the right conditions, actually helps your money grow faster than it would without it. And the people who avoid all debt equally, without distinction, often miss it entirely. Here is the concept at the center of this. Every dollar you have can only do one thing at a time. If you use it to pay down a debt, it eliminates that debt. If you invest it instead, it starts compounding. The question that most people never ask is, which of those two things produces a better outcome for this specific dollar? The answer depends entirely on the interest rate of the debt compared to the expected return of the investment. Let's make this concrete. Say you have a $20,000 student loan at 4% interest. Every year, that loan costs you 4% of whatever you still owe. Now say you also have access to a 401k with an employer match. Your employer matches 100% of your contributions up to 5% of your salary. If you earn $60,000, that is a potential $3,000 in free employer contributions every year, available the moment you contribute. If you pour every spare dollar into paying off the student loan early, you are eliminating a 4% annual cost. That is good. But if you do that instead of contributing to the 401k match, you are leaving a 100% instant return on the table. You are paying 4 cents to avoid spending a dollar that would have immediately doubled. The math on this is not close. The employer match wins by a distance that most people, if they saw it written out, would find genuinely shocking. This is what financial researchers call the debt investment trade-off, and the academic literature on it is surprisingly consistent. A 2021 paper by researchers at the National Bureau of Economic Research found that households that prioritized low-interest debt repayment over tax-advantaged investing consistently underperformed, not because they made bad decisions, but because they applied a simple rule to a situation that required nuance. Now let's talk about credit. One of the quietest costs of avoiding all debt is what it does to your credit score. Your credit score is built from a record of borrowing and repaying. If you never borrow, there is no record to build from. And a thin or non-existent credit file, even with zero debt, can cost you in ways that feel invisible until the moment they don't. A lower credit score means a higher interest rate on a mortgage. On a $300,000 home loan over 30 years, the difference between a credit score of 760 and a credit score of 650 is roughly $60,000 in additional interest paid. Even though you did everything right, even though you avoided debt your entire life, even though you saved responsibly, the person who used a credit card carefully for 10 years, paid it off every month, and built a strong credit history ends up paying significantly less for the same house than the person who avoided all debt entirely. That is not an argument for credit card debt. That is an argument for understanding that credit is a tool, and like any tool, refusing to touch it does not make you safer. It just means you never learned to use it. Here's another angle on this that almost nobody discusses. Some debt enables an asset that appreciates faster than the debt costs. A mortgage is the most common example. If you borrow at 6% to buy a home in a market that appreciates at 4 to 5% annually, and you are also building equity with every payment, and you are getting a tax deduction on the interest, and you are locking in a housing cost that inflation cannot raise, the math on that debt over time often works in your favor in ways that renting at the same cost does not. This is not universally true. It depends on the market, the term, the rate, and your personal situation. But the point is, blanket debt avoidance does not account for any of this. It treats all debt as identical when the differences between them are enormous. The behavioral economist Anna Maria Luzzardi, whose research at George Washington University has shaped how economists think about financial literacy, found something striking in her studies of household finance. People with higher financial literacy do not avoid debt. They use it more selectively. They distinguish between high-cost and low-cost debt. They understand the relationship between interest rates and investment returns. And as a result, they accumulate more wealth over their lifetimes than people who follow simple rules without understanding the reasoning behind them. The rule, avoid debt, was created as a shortcut for people who were drowning in high-interest borrowing. It was never designed to be a complete financial philosophy. Applied too broadly, it becomes its own kind of trap. So what does the alternative actually look like in practice? It starts with one question for every debt situation you face. What is the interest rate? Below roughly 5 to 6%, especially for fixed, predictable debt like student loans or a mortgage, the case for paying it off aggressively before investing is weak for most people in most situations. The math generally favors investing the difference, especially in tax-advantaged accounts. Above 7 to 8%, especially for variable, high-interest debt like credit cards or personal loans. The case for paying it off aggressively is strong. A guaranteed 20% return from eliminating a 20% debt beats almost every investment available. The break-even point sits somewhere in the middle and shifts based on your tax situation, your employer match, your risk tolerance, and your timeline. It is not one number, but it is a number, and knowing how to find it is worth more than any blanket rule. The second thing is this: if you have no debt and no credit history, get one. Open a credit card with no annual fee, use it for one recurring expense, and pay it off in full every month. You will never pay a cent in interest, you will never carry a balance, and over 2 to 3 years, you will build the credit history that saves you tens of thousands of dollars when you eventually need a mortgage. That is not debt. That is a tool used correctly for a specific purpose. The goal was never to avoid debt. The goal was always to build wealth. And sometimes, not always, not recklessly, but sometimes, the path to that goal runs directly through understanding how to use borrowed money wisely rather than avoiding it entirely. You were told that debt is the enemy. Some of it is, and some of it, used carefully, is the reason other people's money is quietly working for you.